I am doing something different for this video. So far in this series, I have used biblical verses to critique capitalism, but the criticisms can happen the other way also. There are capitalists who are able to point to other verses in the Bible and could interpret them in a way of supporting capitalism. And you would likely guess, based on what I've already said on this channel, that I'd be disagreeing with these pro-capitalist arguments that I'll be mentioning in this video, but I wanted to make this video anyways, because if we are to interpret the Bible accurately, we should not conveniently ignore the verses that appear to contradict what we believe. We are not to cherry pick these Bible verses. And though it would be easy for me to just not talk about these verses with how theologically illiterate many people in the country are, I wanted to show a bit of transparency. And also, for showing some more transparency, I would mention that there are obviously more verses in the Bible than the ones I'm going to be mentioning in this video. And I'm saying this in context of transparency because I want to further the discussion. So, if you have a Bible verse in mind that appears to be pro-capitalist and you want me to talk about it, you can leave it down in the comments below, and maybe I'll do a follow-up video in the future. But for now, I got this short list of verses I'll be mentioning, and also explaining my methodology with weighing about how pro-capitalist these verses might be. Because even if I do make a follow-up video, there's still going to be other verses out there that capitalists can point to. So instead, I want to give you some general tips on how to approach verses that I might never be bringing up on this channel. Okay, there's the intro. Time to mention some of these verses. The first three come from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 10:4. Poor is he who works with a slack hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Proverbs 12:11. He who cultivates his land will be satisfied with bread, but he who pursues empty things lacks a heart of wisdom. And Proverbs 13:11. Wealth obtained from empty effort dwindles, but the one who gathers with his hand abounds. So you see a common idea here that if you work, be diligent, you will have success. And this feels like something that's a lot of capitalists want, where your work is correlated to your success. The more you put in, the more you get out. But how far would we apply this verse to the capitalist ideology? One thing that should be obvious to even the capitalists is that these verses are not accurate to all circumstances. Consider, for example, the criticism in some church circles against the so-called prosperity gospel, which has the idea that if you have more faith, you will be rewarded not just in heaven, but also here on earth. Meanwhile, the Bible also has some verses cautioning people that there are going to be times of persecution, so even when they do the right thing, they're not going to have success. Now, are these verses in Proverbs still somewhat relevant to us today? Yes, I believe there are a lot of circumstances where they are applicable. But even with some of the relevance these verses still have, notice that these verses do not say there is only one economic system where these verses apply. These verses touch on an idea in capitalism, hard work and the associated rewards, but the rewards are not strictly conditional to other attributes about capitalism. And the explanation I just gave is an example of one of the methods I can use to go through these verses to see how pro-capitalist they actually are. This method I just showed, you recognize what parts of capitalism it might defend, but also think, is this verse defending the whole of capitalism or just that single aspect? For example, I did not find anything in those verses that supports the competition part of capitalism. Moving on, the next area we're going to look at is in the New Testament. In Matthew 25, there is a passage talking of a parable where a man gives varying amounts of wealth to his servants. The passage specifies that the master gives varying amounts in accordance to the servant's abilities. This reminds me of the capitalist philosophy where if a worker is more capable of doing stuff, you give them a better position where they are able to contribute more with their abilities. And this is a case where I can use another methodology. Recognizing this Bible backed idea is in capitalism, but asking oneself if this philosophy exists in other economic systems. As an example, there are some places out there where the company is structured where the employees elect representatives to be their employers. There are some people that support this model who are consciously against capitalism, but they still recognize the value in having a capable person in that critical position. Later in the parable, the master returns to see about how the servants handled his money. He found out one of the servants didn't do anything with his money, and saying in verse 28, therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. Verse 29, for to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Is this a justification for the wealth gap we see in capitalism? I think not, because note in verse 30, and throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I have heard about that weeping and gnashing of teeth phrase before in association with eternal suffering. Although there are plenty of people that are going to be going to hell and they're not going to have their riches in hell, but that does not mean that the non-believers in the meantime get stripped of their wealth. And actually, while I'm recording this, I just had the thought, how much of this passage is actually talking about money? If this passage is referencing the end of a person's life or the end of the world, perhaps the money mentioned in this parable is not a reference to literal money. Maybe it's instead talking about spiritual value. God prioritizes the long term, and he recognizes that in the long term, spiritual development is far greater than monetary value. Next passage, we got a familiar one that I've mentioned in a previous video on the series. This is 2 Thessalonians 3:10. For even when we were with you, we used to command this to you. If anyone is not willing to work, neither let him eat. And I did express that I agreed with the capitalists on that freeloading is not okay. And while we are talking about this passage again, I would like to clarify a discernment that I have between this passage and what I also mentioned in a previous video about the love of money being a cause of evil. I have a sort of perspective with this profit motive stuff, similar to how some have this perspective on, say, a appetite for food. The appetite for food is not bad by default. I believe it is something that God has given us so that we are pursuing sustenance and to enjoy the food that he has given us. It's when the appetite for food overtakes a person and they overeat, gets too heavy. In that circumstance, a person's appetite degraded into something that it was never meant to be. Now, in this here, with those who don't work, don't eat, I think there is value to have some appetite for money so that a person can be less of a burden to others. But similar to how an appetite for food can go too far, so too can an appetite for money go too far. Like I was talking about in that earlier episode, talking about the way people might cheat each other. So, a person wanting to work hard to feed himself and his family, that is valuable, but when it turns into a reckless pursuit for money and is compromising on morality to do so, that is when I find it becomes a problem. The last verse I got for you today comes from Ecclesiastes 3:13. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks and sees good in all his labor, it is the gift of God. Again, this verse does not specify an economic system. So there you go. There's some explanation as to why I am still not a capitalist, even with verses like these. But before I finish today, a message for the churchgoers out there, whether or not you side with me or not on this economic debate. I encourage you, know the scriptures. I said earlier in the video that there are a lot of people in America that do not have much familiarity with the Bible, which verses are where. And if we're going to have theological debates like this, it is important that we are familiar with the source material that we are citing. I have even heard that there are, say, Muslims out there that will say that Christians do not even know the very book they say they cling to. And the tough part is, those Muslims kind of have a point there. So I encourage the church-going capitalists to ask the question, do you know the book that the Christians so often cite? And maybe even if you do know the scriptures well, you might still disagree with some of the stuff I'm saying here. But I will say this, I would rather a person know the scriptures than to agree with me on the negotiables.